Hi, welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the UpNorth Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. Today, we are exploring the question, is critical thinking a lost art? With us are three guests. My first guest is Chris Kuchuris. He is the author of Puncturing Our Illusion, Developing Your Critical Thinking Attitude. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Next to him is Mella McCormick. She is a philosophy professor over at NMC. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also we have Doug Moser. He is a practicing clinical psychologist and has been a part of the behavioral health field for the last 30 years. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So Chris, I'd like to start with you. What do you think in regards to the question, is critical thinking a lost art?
I think that's really a timely question now. It's the very question that fostered the Department of Education in California, where the push for critical thinking across disciplines really began in the 1980s. And they did a report like boards are wont to do, and they discovered some surprising things from their college graduates, that they were reporting being lonely, being bored, being depressed, being out of touch, being filled with despair, and having all kind of practical and personal problems, and they wondered why. So in the details of the report, they discovered what seemed to be a common theme, that people were having difficulty solving practical problems, real-world problems. And so the word critical thinking is used by philosophers in the early 20th century, but it never really got much play. It was kind of just like a buzzword. And so they tried to come up with a phrase or some concept that would help guide the thinking of this. And so critical thinking was born in the 1980s, many different places, but in Sonoma State in Northern California, that's where most of the work was done. And they tried to come up with a way in which they could infuse what they called critical thinking, not only in college courses, but from kindergarten through high school, as they saw it's something that needed to be done in all courses. And so the movement began there, it spread across the United States. And now, some almost 30 years later, many people would argue that it's become another fad, like No Child Left Behind or this new Common Core thing, top-down learning, bottom-up learning. We've got so many fads in education, both in K through 12 and higher education, that the terms become vague and meaningless. What one person thinks is critical thinking, someone has a totally different definition of. And so in that regard, I think if we want to ask, is critical thinking a lost art? In many ways it has become.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mella, I'm sure you have a slightly different take, perhaps, on the question, is critical thinking a lost art?
Mm-hmm. Well, when discussing critical thinking with my students, I often share with them the following statement. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your decisions, and the quality of your decisions is determined by the quality of your thinking. So I think of critical thinking as a very personal act. And it's one in which there's a direct relationship between how well you are thinking and how well you're living. And of course, the inverse of that would be true as well, that poor thinking can lead to poor living. And so in discussing this with students, I want them to start examining their own lives. And I want them to start thinking about how are their decisions impacting their life, and are they living in a way that they desire? And if they don't, then what can you do to fix that or to change that? And my argument is it lies in your thinking. So that's where we need to go. And then, of course, my work with students is to get more into the details of that. Just what about your thinking needs to be changed or tweaked or fixed. So that's the approach I take with critical thinking. I don't know so much that it's a lost art from that perspective as much as it just hasn't been learned. And you can't forget something or lose something that you never learned in the first place. So in many cases, I'm introducing it to my students for the first time. So
interesting. Mm-hmm. Doug, I'm sure you have a take on the question, is critical thinking a lost art?
Yes, I was thinking this afternoon before coming here how nervous I felt anytime I'm asked to talk about thinking, especially preceded by the word critical. So there's always, there seems to be some pressure on, am I doing this right? Do I need to back up what I say? Am I passing or failing critical thinking 101? So there's some inherent pressure to the whole subject. I think what relaxes me is to realize that for me, the fuel behind my critical thinking is curiosity, just being born with, like we all are, with a pretty strong sense of curiosity. I don't know if everybody has that, but I've felt both blessed and cursed by it at various times in my life. But there's a real nice, that's a real nice way for me to look at it in terms of that's what fuels my own interest in things, and to really want to know what's what and why people say the things that they do and how our decisions are arrived at. And so I think I'll just start with that. The curiosity is a good fuel.
Mm-hmm. So Mella, you made the point that critical thinking is something that needs to be learned. It's not that it's been forgotten by individuals, at least. And Chris, you suggested, I think, maybe culturally, after a big push a number of decades ago, it's kind of waned. Why do you think it is we need to learn the art of critical thinking? It seems in some ways like it's something we'd be born with. Even as a child, you got to figure out how to avoid pain and how to get to where you want to go and problem solve in that sense. But Chris, as you pointed out, the studies are showing people were experiencing a lot of inner turmoil because they couldn't solve practical problems. And you're talking about the need to learn it. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it doesn't come more naturally to us? Any of you can respond to that.
What I've been learning about it, and I'm certainly no expert in the subject, I'm fairly new to the topic formally, but what I've gathered so far is that inherently we're not critical thinkers. We don't naturally, what we do come by naturally are certain ingrained biases and flaws in thinking that have caught the attention of thinkers throughout history, saying, boy, did you see how that person arrived at that? And starting to get interested in flaws and biases. So that almost, to me, means that we have to learn about those things or unlearn those and then substitute them with other skills like precision and learning to be precise and accurate, and learning how to think in broad terms, and also to a depth and apply things and make sure that things are relevant, because those things don't necessarily come natural.
Mm-mm. I'm glad you raised the question, Anthony, because I think that's a common misperception that's made about critical thinking, that because as humans we're born with the ability to think, that automatically implies we're thinking well. And we're not. It's true you are born with the ability to think, but you have to actually learn how to think well, or how to think critically in terms of the language we're using today. In discussing critical thinking with my students, I always describe it as being a skill. And so not unlike other skills that we encounter in life, such as learning how to play a musical instrument or learning an athletic discipline, that in all those instances, you first have to just receive a basic education on the task at hand, and then you have to practice it. And you have to practice it over and over and over again. Critical thinking, I argue, is just the same. You have to learn the basics of it, and there are objective concepts and tools and instruments, and then you just have to practice using them. And with practice, you get better and better at it. And then it can become second nature to you, but you're not born knowing how to think critically. I think we'd like to believe that about ourselves, but I think life quickly illustrates to us otherwise.
Maybe the instrument analogy is a good one, that many of us are born with the sense that we're musical, but there's no way we're going to become musicians unless we practice a particular instrument.
Right.
I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, Doug mentioned biases, that we, as human beings, we have biases. And I think I would add to that, we're emotional creatures, right? And we have very sophisticated brains that have almost, we've studied different parts of our brains, and the part where emotions come from and where we can where critical thinking might dwell or happen, right? And those can be truly in conflict. Isn't that part of what's going on when we need to be, maybe not turn off the emotions, which some would say, the only way to have logical and rational thought is to eliminate emotion altogether. I would argue that's not exactly true, but to be able to at least understand what those biases are. That's how I understand it. Can you expand on that a little more, though, of how emotion can override or impact our thinking and specifically our ability to critically think?
It seems that part of the problem is that as children, we're taught, maybe necessarily because we can't reason when we're 1 year old and 2 years old, at least not well. We're taught to conform. We're taught to obey. You need to do this, you should do that. And you would hope along the way that good parents and good schools would also begin to blend in the reasons why you should do that and teach children how to think. But more often than not, that doesn't happen. And so what do children do then? And what do young adults do? And then what do adults do? They function not on the basis of sound reasoning necessarily, but on the basis of all kind of myths and superstitions and traditions, things we call pseudo-reasoning. They get involved in self-deception and rationalizations. And so the emotional aspect comes in as well, because it's difficult sometimes to look at yourself and be critical when that's the way you've always been, or that's the way all of your people have always been. And we tend to have a self-righteous streak in that regard, very difficult to overcome. So that's, I think, another argument for why this needs to be done at an early age, because the habits of childhood linger into adulthood unless something else comes along to replace them. So that's how I see that one.
And it's also worth noting, human beings are natively egocentric. And egocentrism also often is, discussed in a negative light, but it's also just an objective truth about us, that we are limited to understanding this world through our own perception. That doesn't mean that you can't intellectually push yourself beyond that, but that's what you have to learn about. You have to be taught how to do that and the value of that. So we always have to just appreciate what is our native state of being and how can we evolve beyond it. So.
Now, speaking of how kids are affected, it just struck me as you were talking, Chris. Last night I walked past the room door of my youngest son and I noticed he was on his bed covered up entirely with a blanket. I knew something was wrong, so I went in and I pulled the blanket back, and I didn't say, "What are you thinking?" I said, "What are you feeling?" And it's a question I think we ask kids over and over again, because it's a real poignant way to connect, and kids are better expressing their feelings. And perhaps what you're talking about, Chris, and you can expound on this if you'd like, is moving beyond that initial, I want to understand how you feel, to helping a child begin to filter, is what I'm feeling appropriate? How much should my feelings about this situation be the thing that dominates the experience of it? And at what point do I get the rest of myself involved in it?
Well, I think that there are several things at play there. One is, and it's pretty obvious, that your parents then have to be already thinking critically in order for them to do it. And if they're not, then that might not occur. And we live in a culture that's almost counter to critical thinking. We live in a culture where we're taught from all angles and pushed to conform, to be consumers, to go with the flow, not to question. I mean, there are even some schools that teach children not to question, just sit and be quiet. And so it's not simply that we don't teach critical thinking, that something has filled the vacuum that's working against that. And I've heard from students over the years many, many, many times that it's difficult to engage in critical thinking because they feel like they're almost like traitors to their beliefs. And they don't want to be involved in that. It's somehow dirty for them. So those are a couple more difficulties.
Can we take a moment then and actually outline what it means to have critical thought? What is that process? I mean, it's obviously intentional. It's obviously, as you said, something that we can learn. But what is the actual active intention. How would you describe critical thinking then?
I'll just give a very general definition that critical thinking is the art of analyzing and evaluating thinking with a view to improving it. So
what's the layman's explanation?
That's said a lot
How does
right
that
there.
work?
Right.
How does that work on our day-to-day?
Well, I think
lives?
the very first thing then one has to acknowledge when it comes to critical thinking is it entails humility. It means recognizing that my thinking is flawed, that I make mistakes, that I'm not perfect. So accepting that and then wanting to actually actively do something about that. So that's where the analyzing and the evaluating comes in. And you need specific tools and instruments on how to do that. And actually, Doug mentioned several of them. In my instruction of critical thinking, I speak of intellectual standards. And these standards consist of things like clarity, accuracy, detail, depth, breadth, significance, relevance, logicalness. So there's all these criteria that must be met in order for you to be demonstrating critical thinking as opposed to just some other form of thinking. But at the heart of it, though, does lie that intellectual humility. And then, in addition to that, I would say intellectual courage, intellectual perseverance. I mean, it is difficult work. And Chris, I really appreciate the comment about students feeling like they're being a traitor. And it's not only being a traitor to themselves, it's also a traitor to those from whom they've inherited their thinking from. So family, friends, community, church, etc. And that going hand in hand with our native egocentrism, much of our thinking is borrowed. It's borrowed thinking. It's not ours. It's not original. And so we go through life with this inherited thinking and never thinking to question it or take ownership of it. And by taking ownership, I mean you've examined it and you've done that analysis and that evaluating in order to make it your thinking. And so what critical thinking is asking a person to do, it's definitely not meant to comfort you.
It's not for the cowardly.
No, it's not. It's not.
Would you say it's the opposite then of intuitive thinking? Or can they happen simultaneously or somehow in conjunction? Or are they polar opposites?
I don't think they're opposed. I think that's two different functions. And so to just piggyback on what Mella had to say, that if we take the term critical thinking out of the realm of philosophy and get at the nuts and bolts, if you talked about musical thinking or medical thinking or biological thinking, there'd be a process to it. Mm-hmm. Critical thinking is the same. And so it's about, I use the metaphor of a doctor diagnosing a patient. And so a doctor in their diagnosis has to be educated in several different ways. And a diagnosis usually requires them to know all of the parts of the body and how those parts function and when they're functioning well and when they're functioning poorly, and the standards by which or the tests by which you can gauge that. And thinking is the same way. In the same way a musician or a composer might take a score apart and look for different parts and see how this part's working with that part and why this one's not working well here. We can do the same with our own thinking. If it's about a particular decision or a larger cause or a movement, we can ask and there are very objective parts to thinking. So for example, what is the purpose of your thinking? That would be a part. What's the question that's driving your thinking or the problem that you're engaged in? How are you going to address that problem? What evidence do you have to support your problem? And then to go along with Mella's description of standards, then you can ask, has your purpose been stated clearly or is it vague? Is your question significant or is it designed to throw us off track, for example? Or is the evidence that you've put forth to support your idea or to support the solution to your problem clear? Is it relevant? Is it logical? And these things. And this is the way we can begin to gauge when we're thinking about something, how well are we doing it? Not simply in a circular way where I think well, so all my thinking is good, that's why I think well. That sounds like my dad, you know.
I'm smart,
Sounds
so
like
all
my
my
dad.
thoughts are smart.
That's right.
I'm curious, in the behavioral health field, as you've dealt with clients over the years, do you find that that there's a significant role that rationality or reasoning well plays in either the bringing about of whatever dilemma they're facing or whatever situation they're in? Is it a significant part of the solution? Or is it something that tends to be dealt with on a more emotional level, or perhaps they're intertwined in ways that makes it tough to see where a dividing line is?
It's a great question. Historically, and I come to the field not as a recovering addict or alcoholic, so I owe a lot of my learning to my work with addicts and alcoholics. Historically, recovering alcoholics say they actually, in a way, downplay thinking. My best thinking got me here. My best thinking got me drunk. And there's a strong history of actually not thinking early in recovery for an addict or an alcoholic, but to basically do what they're told. And it tends to work. Now we know why. We know that neurologically, when the midbrain or the limbic brain gets assaulted and hijacked, if you will, by addictions, behavioral addictions or substance addictions, the activity is so strong in the limbic brain that it actually inhibits the very apparatus that we have that allows thinking, which is the frontal cortex, or circuitry in the frontal cortex. So a lot of addicts or alcoholics, their family members would say to them after their second or third DUIL, "What were you thinking?"
Right.
And they would say, "I wasn't," and now we
And
know
right.
now we know neurologically that that's the case. So there is a period of time where an addict or an alcoholic is particularly vulnerable. In other words, their limbic system is still prone to be activated by cues and triggers and sights and sounds of getting high or drinking. The limbic brain is also very excitable still, and the frontal cortex hasn't gotten on board. It might not have even been mature at age 22. It might have been stunted in a way by, for some, a decade already of using substances. So the process of quieting the limbic brain and learning to actually get the frontal cortex up to speed is a very delicate and for some slow process. So the thinking ability is not all that strong yet. So there's a lot of vulnerability in that period of time. So it plays a very strong role. I think one of the, again, historic routes to that has been to use religion and spirituality as a way to guide the person. The person's frontal cortex is not all that active,
Right.
or under the assault of and the high volume talk of the limbic brain. So in the past, it's been made easy in a way to say, you don't need to do your thinking, follow this text, follow this tenet, follow this path. Now, in general, we know that there's some wisdom in that. It's basically, if you don't have a good frontal cortex, you need to put yourself in the presence of people who do have a frontal cortex. It's interesting that when I work with addicts and alcoholics, even when they don't have a lot of sobriety or recovery, if I or somebody else shares a good idea, I can see them instinctually nod. It's as if their frontal cortex has enough capacity to recognize a good idea. Does it mean their limbic brain is quieted? No, that's still a force to be reckoned with.
So it recognizes it, but doesn't generate it, at least for a while.
Correct, or doesn't generate it to the volume that can compete with the messages of the limbic brain.
So are you aware of any process that would work in the opposite? Is there something that we could do as humans, and I'm sure it would be a substance again, but to maybe stimulate the other part of the brain that would stimulate the critical thinking part of the brain? Are we aware of anything that? You know, I mean, I'll say it another way. Alcohol can make most people be pretty dumb, or their behavior make them appear like they are, whatever, for lack of a better term. But, you know, is there an opposite effect? Can I do something, seek something to really stimulate and become a much smarter person very quickly?
I think, again, from my experience and what I read and write, it's more a process of quieting the limbic brain, and the frontal cortex will take care of itself. It will develop a capacity to, at least what is possible within any given person, it will develop a reasonable capacity to function.
So it's the competition between the two that causes the...
It's definitely an interaction, but it's not so much of, you know, drink a lot of carrot juice and smoothies to certain enzymes that will help you be smarter. It's a matter of learning.
No magic pill.
No magic pill.
I'm glad to hear that carrot juice is not the answer.
It'll make you see better,
But
apparently.
would I be maybe accurate in guessing that, if I'm hearing what you're saying, that maybe meditation then or something, because you said quiet that other part of the brain. Is that where meditation comes into play then?
It certainly can help develop a healthy detachment or a more mindful approach to disidentify from the drama of the limbic brain and the person's stressors of early recovery, for sure. But again, the place that a lot of behavioral health medicine is going these days is to discovering certain foods and medications that actually will quiet the midbrain long enough for the frontal cortex to get on board. And then once that happens, again, particularly if the person's in the company of people who have good frontal cortexes, is that the right plural? You start to see it happening. So you don't have to really do anything to make the frontal cortex work better, other than get yourself around people who can give you some good, strong advice.
So choose your friends wisely is sage advice.
Yes.
So the advice our grandparents always gave us about choosing our friends well,
Yeah.
it's a very practical
And
merit to it.
if I may, the humility that's been discussed is a real important practice in terms of saying, I don't have good frontal cortex thinking right now and probably won't for the next several months. Will you help me out? Will you give me some ideas? And that's actually the beginnings of critical thinking, is to realize what you don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Kimberli, to offer a response to your question of, well, what can we use to stimulate our critical thinking? I think the classic parental response would be, go to college. I don't think there is a substance that can do it. I think it does take effort. It's just work, and nothing can replace the work. So
You mentioned, Mella, you tell your students that poor thinking can lead to poor living. It sounds like the opposite is true as well, that poor living can lead to poor thinking. Very clearly you see it in the realm of addictions. But I'm kind of curious, in a broader sense, do the three of you see a correlation? So let's take it out of the realm a bit of something that's an obvious type of thing, like a substance abuse. Do you sense that there's a way in which not only is the way we're thinking leading to life choices that can be bad, but that as people make choices sitting in front of a TV, playing video games all day, and I don't mean to open Pandora's box there, I'm not anti all that, but especially since you work with students, and I'm not sure what age range you work with, do you see a reverse correlation as well, that you see people where you go, oh, I think the way you've chosen to use your time is hindering your ability to think well also?
I think that they do go hand in hand, and what we see, and going off what Doug says, is there's lots of obstacles for the person who's willing to think critically, let alone their inability to know what that means. It could be an addiction, it could be homelessness, it could be a health issue, it could be emotional trauma. So many things get in the way that us so-called normal people may look at someone and say, well, why can't you just buck up and get with it? Well, there are many reasons why not. And so it becomes a really difficult task to try to sort all that out. I think we also live in an incredibly complex world where maybe 100 years ago, young people and adults weren't confronted with such a great amount of problems either in their own personal lives or in the world. Life was simpler, and they got a break from all this. And so maybe one of the reactions of some young people is, this is a way to disengage. Life is just so overwhelming that playing video games for a few hours or days or whatever it might be, or maybe even substance abuse in a more extreme, is a coping mechanism. It might not be a good one, but it can be something like that as well.
You know, though, another reason why I think instruction in critical thinking is so important is because whether we realize it or not, our actions are a reflection of our thinking. I see our actions as being external representatives of our internal thought process. So, and we've all heard the expressions, actions speak louder than words, or think before you act, right? But a growing concern that I have with my students, and the young students in particular, so Anthony, you did mention young people, is that there seems to be this cognitive dissonance between their actions and their thinking. In other words, they seem to have distanced their actions from themselves, as in, my actions don't truly represent who I am.
That's not me.
That's not really me. When it's, well, then who is it?
Right.
You know? And so when I hear statements from my students like, I realize I procrastinated on my paper and I'm turning it in late, but really I'm a good student. Right. Or I've been skipping classes, I haven't done any of the work, but my education is important to me. Well, we have a contradiction here. We have a conflict here of that's not what your actions are revealing or speaking on your behalf. And so, again, why I think critical thinking is so important for everybody, but for our young students in particular, to fully acknowledge and appreciate that when they act, that is their voice. That is a type of message they are sending out there. And what do you want to be saying about yourself? What do you want to be projecting? What do you want people to know about you?
Have you had conversations with students where you see that disconnect in which, or maybe you've had them over a course of classes, and you felt like you were able to see a trajectory in their life where those two things began to come together? Do you have positive experiences with that, or does this feel like that this is a problem maybe that's going to be facing upcoming generations, and what do we do?
Well, I've been in the position where I've had to serve as like the wake-up call, which is not a fun position to be in. The don't kill the messenger. I have to try to alert my students to what's going on here. And again, it's nobody likes to be critical of themselves, and nobody wants to find fault with themselves. And yet it's so important, though, you know, in terms of our own well-being, ultimately, and the well-being of those around us. So it's very challenging and sensitive work. So.
As well said.
I'm curious about the big picture of how our culture perceives critical thinking. And I know, Chris, at the very beginning you talked about back in the 80s kind of trying to incorporate critical thinking in the curriculum and the K through 12 curriculum. I know philosophy is not part of the K through 12 curriculum. Mm-hmm. I think it's, if taught at all, an elective probably at high school level, but not a required class. Yeah. And what I'm wondering as I'm asking that is, and I know you said this in a way, but in a broader picture, if critical thinking has been thought of being in the realm of philosophy, where rational and logical thought has mostly, I think, been thought of as being in the realm of science, and that intuitive, missing a word here, but intuitive thought maybe being more almost over in the range of religious thought or with faith and those kinds of things. How do you separate those? Are they supposed to be in those separate are they supposed to be in those separate compartments, or do they overlap? And have we kind of missed the boat here if we're saying critical thinking is only in the realm of philosophy? Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
So
I know I
do
didn't
think
really
that
say that as succinctly as I meant to.
I'm not so sure it's an overlap, is that they kind of go hand in hand. So I would see the ability to have an intuition as the result of having developed good critical thinking habits, a kind of practical wisdom where you don't have to rethink the whole thing. You just kind of intuitively know what to do. So you have to ask the question, well, what informs the intuition? Is it some kind of divine intuition, in which case you're really out of the picture, it just happened to you? Or is it the result of you've been thinking about a particular thing and you've gotten good at it over time? And so you don't need to go through the entire process to make a decision or to notice something. You could think of an example of maybe in sports when an athlete is in the zone and they're not thinking about it's basketball time of the year, so they might not be thinking of all of the steps it takes to make a good shot, square your shoulders, hold the ball. Like, it's just from doing it so many times and having the good habit of it, it's something that they do intuitively in that regard. I think anybody with that kind of skill and art, whether it's an artist, it could be the art of medicine, it could be a musician, they have lots of intuitive qualities, but they come after all of the hard work of the practice that's gone into it. That's how I would see that.
So do you think, though, we're at a disadvantage if you're describing it as a big picture way of thinking, and how do we teach our young people how to think in these terms? Do we have to put it in some kind of box and say this is where it fits? I think that's what I'm getting at, right? Or is that we're at a disadvantage if we do that, if we think of it only in terms of a certain class that it fits in, only in terms of a certain, do you know what I'm going?
It might be interesting, and I'm not a parent, and it's been many years since I've taught kids or worked with kids, but it might be interesting to encourage kids to practice both. Go with an intuitive thought, run with it within reason, see how it unfolds, and then the next time you have an intuitive thought, apply one or two of the standards of critical thinking to it and see what happens to that intuition. Does it actually complement the intuitive impulse? Does it add something to it? Does it detract away from it? And at some point, too, I'm glad you used a word that sometimes gets used a lot. In some of my readings on critical thinking, the subject of language and words comes up. So having to define, what do you mean by intuitive? Because we have biases and inherent flaws in our thinking, it might feel, an intuition might feel like the first thing that happens, the first impulse that arises. So something might be intuitive, but in actuality, it's a very strong bias that we're not even conscious of. But it feels right because it's the first thing that we think of or we feel that we want to act on. So it gets tricky.
Well, I think what you're talking about when we're talking about teaching children, a story comes to mind. I took several self-defense classes in college, being a woman. And what I learned from that is that women in our society are taught to kind of not just defer, but be polite, and not to stand up for ourselves in certain ways. And so young women tend to not get out of situations that maybe they should be because they don't want to be perceived as being rude. They don't want to be perceived, right? But being taught to rely on that, perhaps intuition, if that's the right word, that I shouldn't be here right now, I shouldn't be in this situation, and I need to get out, and they override it because we're taught to ignore that. And I think that happens in a lot of other situations too, where I would say you need to trust your gut, you need to listen to that voice, in those kinds of situations. But it almost goes against, if I understand where critical thinking is, that we almost need to question that first thought because it comes from emotion, bias, all those things, to then shift in the other part of our brain toward critical thinking on certain issues. So the key really is then, when do we know which to use? Because there certainly is times when we should go with that immediate gut intuition reaction, right?
It's their critical feeling.
Well, according to Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink, there's definitely, maybe you
Yes.
can speak to that a little bit, that's maybe a collective, like trusting our brain. There's so much going on in here that we have to trust that brain, that in a blink, we know the answer. So,
Right.
yeah, the real key is knowing when you're supposed to go with one and not, or the
Well,
other.
that's the problem with intuition, because you
Right.
can have an incorrect intuition.
Right,
You can talk,
right.
you can think you know something about somebody and you get them very wrong. Hence the need to think through it a little bit more.
And everybody has a batting average. A lot of people don't like to, they don't like to wear it, and but yeah, in baseball it's right on the screen. Every time a batter goes to the plate, you know exactly what that person's batting average is. But
Right.
we like to think, I think that we're better at intuitive living than we really are.
Well, I suppose back in the day when we saw movement in the grass, if we didn't think saber-toothed tiger,
Right.
flee,
You weren't going to be around very long.
we wouldn't
to
be
worry
around
about it.
to have that extra time to think, more critically, right? So that's kind of hardwired
Yeah.
in us, I'm sure.
Well, it seems then that the more important or more significant the issue that you're dealing with, the more that's at stake with your intuition. So if it's something like, I don't know, something serious like, should we go to war or not, might not want to act on your first intuition. We might want to think it through. But if it's, what should I have for breakfast today, and you get it wrong, well, the consequences might not be so dire. But going back to your question about where do we put critical thinking, is it a separate class, or how do we deal with that? I think that from my perspective, it should not be a separate class, even though I've taught the class. It should be part of every class.
Yeah.
And there's been an argument ongoing for over 20 years now between people in critical thinking and boards of education on what that means. So boards still are concerned about students learning content. All our textbooks are written towards content, and they want them to have a body of knowledge in whatever grade level they're at, and standardized tests are designed supposedly to test how much of that body of knowledge do you know. But knowing something and memorizing something are quite different. And so the argument from the critical thinking point is that thinking is the content. That if you don't teach a student how to think through the subject matter and ask questions like, what is a historical question? If you're studying history, is it just what happened when? Or do you have to know what's the purpose of this particular question to get back to the parts of thinking? Why is this a significant question? How have we answered it? Is our answer narrow? Does it only come from one perspective? Or does it have breadth where we get to see all the different views that bear on this? And so there's been this fight, and the fight is ongoing between what does it mean to be educated? On one hand, we have people saying that to be able to think through the topic, to be able to understand not just the conclusions that scientists or authors come to, but the thinking that underwrites those, the reasons why, and how to sort that out and how to make sense of it. Without that, all we have is conclusions shorn from that thinking, and you can test for that. But one of the dilemmas we're seeing now, and there's been lots of recent research, is that students can't transfer that. So once they've left school, even if they've taken like higher level math courses, they can do the math problem at the board, but they can't do anything with it after that. For example, if they go into engineering or into physics or something like that, they struggle with math, even though they've done really well. So,
Okay, you've just about quoted something I was reading on a website called the Critical Thinking Community, and they were noting in classes, one of the dilemmas is they teach history but not historical thinking.
Right.
They teach biology but not biological thinking. And then one of their conclusions was, the author said, when I read closely, I take ownership of important ideas in a text. But when I write substantively, I'm able to say something worth saying about something worth saying something about. Which I thought was interesting. It seemed, at least in this article, this idea that beyond simply the gaining of information and knowledge of facts, one of the best ways to learn to think critically is to regurgitate it in some fashion, put it into your own words, and be able to present it to someone else. In your experience as teachers and in working in the behavioral health field, do you feel like there's some merit to that idea, the importance of not simply absorbing, but learning how to give back or to say it again?
Well, I often share with my students that a reflection on how well you understand something is your ability to explain it to somebody else.
Okay.
So, if you struggle to explain something, well, then that would seem to suggest that you don't fully understand it. And that's not a crime or a sin. It's just a matter of you've got more work to do. But yes, and I like, Anthony, that you used the word taking ownership. And I hear from my students that they felt very disengaged from their learning. Like there was no ownership there. There was nothing of their own there. It was just a matter of being told what to think rather than how to think. And for those reasons and more, the student didn't find it very meaningful. And how often have you heard from young people, or maybe you even uttered these words as well? When am I ever going to use this in life? Right? That's a fair question. That's a very fair question on behalf of the student, because they haven't been taught, or it hasn't been explained to them in terms of why this is important and what they can do with it in life.
And the reality is they might not use the product, but they're going to use the process.
Right. As long as the process is the primary focus.
Yeah. Which raises another question in my mind. Do you think the most important part of critical thinking skills is the process, or is it the journey or the destination, if that question makes sense?
Yes.
I agree with that. He's right.
Is there a chime?
No, I'd say the journey. I'm going journey. In fact, that's another one of my concerns with critical thinking today, that we're oversimplifying it and we're just seeing it purely as a tool to get me some sort of positive outcome. And if it doesn't get me the outcome I want, then I discard it with all the other quick fix gadgets that didn't live up to their promise, right? So I'm completely an advocate for it's the journey, it's the process, it's the practicing, it's the work, it's the skill, and I firmly believe the more you do it, the more positive outcomes will come from it. But it all goes back to are we talking about the means to the end, or the end goal itself, right? And so I think it is about the journey. But that's
I think it's mostly about the journey. I think the end has a little role. So I think the critical thinking movement, I remember asking this question once, well, what's the goal? What if goals and purposes are one of the parts of thinking, then what's the goal of this? And the person I was speaking with said, well, it's happiness. That it's all about having a happy life, and which raises another million philosophical questions. But
We could do a whole show on that.
we could do it, yeah, you could. But it was about as the end in itself, thinking as the end, just doing the thinking. What I took from that is it's about authoring your own life instead of just simply conforming or being robotic. It's about the ability to make choices not out of your instincts or your cultural conditioning or your biological aspects, but out of your own sense of freedom to create yourself. And in thinking, that's what you do. And if you're not thinking critically, then the ability to be authentic gets diminished with each part of that. And I think maybe that's why people report having unfulfilled lives, or lives that are filled with despair or boredom.
Expand on that. You said when critical thinking doesn't happen, the ability to live authentically is diminished.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
I think that in making a choice, your choice has to be guided by something. If it's guided simply by your conditioning as a child, what you learned from your parents, not that that's right or wrong, but to the extent that it's simply inherited, as Mella said, or unexamined. We go back to Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. I think what he meant by that is, if you're simply acting on someone else's ideas, which sometimes we have to do, but if that's the entire content of your character, then you're not authoring your own life. You're living someone else's life. So I ask my students, what would you prefer? Do you want to be in someone else's play, or do you want to write your own part in the play? And I think that when you are thinking critically, this is the kind of ownership of both good and bad. My thinking got me into trouble, or today was a bad day, I wasn't thinking so well, or whatever it might be, or today was a good day, I did this and I was successful at it.
And you can be proud of that.
Yeah.
You can own that.
And it's also maybe kind of like we see it in children. So when a child learns how to tie their shoe, maybe Doug, you can speak to the psychological part of this, or when they learn how to zip a zipper for the first time, or any of the many, many milestones in child development that we take for granted as adults. A kid learns how to tie their shoes. It's not simply a practical problem I've now solved and I don't need mom or dad anymore to do that for me. They feel like I've done something. I've brought myself into being. I've changed myself. I'm beginning to I am a shoe tire now. And they look at their little brother like, you're not a shoe tire. You're a baby. I'm a big boy. I'm 5, but I'm a big boy. You know?
Put my own toothpaste on.
That's right.
Brush.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as adults, that stuff I think continues. So I would agree that this ownership and being authentic are the promise of critical thinking.
Well, when we talk about taking it into practical application, as you said, students saying, when will I ever use this in the real world? You know, can I remember asking that with calculus once? But critical thinking makes more sense to me as being useful to me. So when we give examples, we usually take it to the extreme, right? So the extreme of how will emotional thought impact my critical thinking, that can happen in a crisis situation, right? I mean, I'm a pilot of an airplane and all of a sudden the altimeter is spinning wildly and this kind of thing. Can I act on intuitive thinking or is the only way I'm going to get out of that situation to rely on my critical thinking and the information and logic that I have, that I can bring to bear in that moment? And how quickly can I do that? I was listening this morning to our military has done a lot of research into this and done a lot of tests on personnel, doing things, putting them under stress and a lot of pressure in these emotional situations, thinking they're being fired upon, and how much longer does it take to do a simple task or to figure out how to fix a broken radio, that kind of thing. It always takes longer, when we're under that kind of stress. So when we talk in those terms as far as practical application of critical thinking, what other kinds of examples would you give your students? Would you give your patients, clients, as far as why critical thinking applies to you today? Any thoughts on?
I have, in a way, privy to ask people what they're thinking, as well as what they're feeling, and sometimes people wear their feelings more on their sleeve than others. So it's more obvious, but still I have to ask what they're feeling if they're more, if it's harder to determine. To know what someone's thinking, I have to ask, they have to speak, so I have to engage in conversation of some kind. Because as you were saying, the words they use will reflect their thinking, their thoughts that go through their mind. And so it's a fascinating and a wonderful part of the job that I do is to get people to talk, and when they talk, I can have some sense of what they're thinking, and then it's the delicate nature of you were saying, Mella, you have to sometimes bear the bad news and figure out how to tell people stuff that's critical in nature, that's feedback and input. So a lot of work goes into that, and how to say it, how to be tactful, but it's offering people some sincere feedback, and maybe you do this as a parent. Again, I'm not a parent, but maybe parents just do this. They come to just get good at it. Is your thinking? I find that your thinking is flawed. And so what do you mean? And then a discussion can happen here, and it's not like I'm saying my thinking is right, but it's at least giving them here's the way I think about this. And so sometimes, again, if their head's going like this when I'm telling them what I'm thinking, it just starts to open the door to what is a more broad thought or inclusive thought. And they recognize that if their thought was exclusive and only thinking in a very narrow term, when they hear an inclusive thought, sometimes they'll, again, instinctually nod their head. They recognize, oh, there is some breadth there that they were excluding, again, only because perhaps that they haven't used that part of their frontal cortex for a while, or it's been under the influence of the limbic brain's onslaught of dopamine and serotonin for months and years.
I've been known to use the phrase with my youngest son, how did that seem like a good idea?
Kimberli, though, to offer one take on the question of what is the practical application of critical thinking, philosophy has definitely been a discipline that's been under attack. I mean, we've been downgraded over the years. What are you going to do with a philosophy degree, right? And the common response to that, jokingly, but it gets laughs for a reason, is that you're going to ask the question, do you want paper or plastic, or do you want fries with that, right? And so what we in philosophy particularly are trying to raise people's awareness to is that the byproducts of critical thinking is better communication skills, problem-solving abilities, right? Being able, to think with that breadth and depth. And so that's going to be useful no matter what occupation you plan on going into. So critical thinking isn't designed to prepare you for a specific job. It's designed to prepare you for any job. And so the practical application,
It's life,
Yeah.
it sounds like, right?
Yeah. So I don't know what you wouldn't use it for.
Well, that sums it up well. And I'm looking at the clock saying we need to wrap it up, and I don't think we could sum it up any better than that. So critical thinking is has a practical application for life. Well, thank you for joining us today and trying, at least in some way or shape, to tackle this question. It's a pretty big question. Is it lost? I hope not. And it sounds like the three of you at least are out there fighting the good fight to make sure that it's not. Thank you for that. And thank you at home for watching In Focus.